Just because we can say with this student, you should do this and this works, doesn't mean with the next student is also going to work exactly the same way. I know administrators are pulled in all kinds of different directions, and they also really, for the most part, unless they have a background somehow in special education, in neurodiversity, they don't know a lot either. And they're being held to laws and district policies even harder than the teachers are.
The feelings people have about finally confirming they're neurodivergent can show up in a lot of forms, including a sense of grief. It might look like the loss of what could have been, the weight of unmet needs, or the years spent trying to fit into systems that never really worked. In schools, that often meant masking missed signs and carrying those burdens silently into adulthood. For ADHDers, that unprocessed grief can magnify challenges like time distortion, memory struggles, or executive overload. Dr. Jennifer Dall, a grief-informed neurodivergence specialist and founder of ADHD Holistically, is here to share her perspective. That's straight ahead on episode 289. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
It's no secret that the current political climate has made conversations about inclusion, disability rights, and education more complicated, and sometimes more discouraging. Supporting neurodivergent people in this environment can feel overwhelming. That's why finding community matters so much. Having a place where others get it makes the work feel sustainable. If you need that kind of support, come find us. You can follow our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Or if you're looking for even more connection and interaction, join our Facebook group, the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group, where these conversations continue long after the episode ends. It's easier to keep moving forward when we know we're not alone. Dr. Jennifer Dall is with me in a minute.
previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
It's not just the accountability piece. I think kids build self-esteem from being accountable and successful when they do things independently. And I think sometimes when we swoop in to save them, we steal their self-esteem a little bit. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is can become a slow development of learned helplessness. And I completely do not think the intention is negative from parents at all. It's not malintended. It's meant to be helpful. But going back to just like your physical muscles, you have to let your children exercise those executive functioning muscles, even if it doesn't always work out.
That's episode 222. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Jennifer Dall, a grief-informed neurodivergence specialist and the founder of ADHD Holistically. She brings more than 25 years of experience as an educator and administrator, coach, and grief educator, and her approach blends professional expertise with her own lived experience. Jen was diagnosed as ADHD in her 50s, and her work focuses a lot on late diagnosis and masking and the misconceptions that so many ADHDers, especially women, face. Through her courses and workshops, she helps individuals and the professionals who support them reframe ADHD as a source of strength and possibility. So Jen, I am so glad that you're here.
I am so happy that you invited me, Emily. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Since you and I both spent so much time working in schools, we've really both seen how often ADHD really can fly under the radar, especially for girls. But there are a lot of times when, for a lot of kids, that ADHD doesn't even get noticed until much later, maybe even into adulthood. I'm curious about your perspective on what it is about the way that schools are set up, or maybe the way that educators are trained, that makes it so easy to miss those signs early on.
Oh, wow. How much time do we have? And my perspective has changed over time. I taught a long time. So I started in the mid 90s. So over that time, as you know, the way we looked at ADHD, the way we looked at schools, our society, everything has changed dramatically. I think that some of it is that there's a lot of misconceptions, untruths, if you will, about ADHD. You think of ADHD, you bring it up to a lot of people, and what do they think of? That 8-year-old boy who is, bouncing all over the walls and simply cannot control himself. I think that teachers, much like professionals, doctors, psychologists, everybody, they don't get a lot of training in it. Our research has lagged. There hasn't been a lot on girls and women and other ways of seeing ADHD. And research takes a while to get out into the world, right? They have to do the research. That takes time, has to be approved and get out, and the word has to get out. So there's this lack of knowledge and lack of training. I mean, I have a master's in special education, and I have a doctorate in educational psychology, and still the amount that was spent on ADHD was not very much. I know when I talk to teachers about different aspects of ADHD, often they were surprised and wanted to know more. So I think a lot of it is just people don't know what they don't know, and they're basing it on what they think they know, which is usually, like with many things, based on the loudest, the most disruptive, the most annoying, if you will, aspects of it. So they don't see that girl, or even, some boys who are just have ADHD but are just quietly sitting there, what's going on? They think that it's other things. Sometimes it's attributed to personality. You're just lazy. You're just this. You're difficult. Often, not always, but sometimes these girls are also then very intelligent, right? They're average or higher than average. And so then people around them, their parents, their teachers get frustrated. You're so smart. Why don't you do this? Why can't you do this? You do so well in this subject. Why do you just not do anything in this other subject? And so they just don't understand. So to get back and answer your question, I think lack of understanding and knowledge is a big part of it.
I think there's also barriers about what teachers even feel like they can say or do, because it's tricky. When we're talking about ADHD in the schools, we're often not necessarily talking about academic struggles in the way that you would talk about like a learning disability, like a specific learning disability in reading, like dyslexia or something like that. The way that ADHD has been quote unquote supported in the schools has been primarily through a behavioral lens where we are disciplining kids or giving consequences to kids based on executive functioning difficulties.
Right.
And I think that that's also part of what prevents the schools from going through this. But I just know from the number of parents that I've worked with over the years how frustrating it is to not understand what's really happening in the schools in a way that is useful to move forward.
I agree. That's a really good point. And it's so hard to explain. And having been a teacher, the classes are big and you've got lots of students, and you every year have more curriculum and more standards and more expectations. It is a lot to juggle. And so if you have a student with ADHD who is acting up, like you said, that tends to get looked at through a harsh behavioral lens. If you have an ADHD student who's just sitting there off in their own world with the executive functions not working, not getting things done, it's easier to either miss over them because of everything else that's going on, or then also look at it behaviorally. Like, you're not doing your work, you didn't do this, so you don't get to go to recess. If you're talking about younger kids, older kids, secondary kids, you can't go on this activity, or you can't do these other things, or we're going to give you somewhere where you get even more time slowed down, but not really a lot more help. And so you can't take an elective that might be far more interesting and helpful to you. So there's just a lot. And I know parents are very frustrated, and often what parents see at home isn't what teachers see in school. It's hard. There's not a simple solution.
There's awareness that's growing.
Yes.
It's just slow. And I think for ADHDers, we're not always the most patient people. So,
But there's also that, at least partly, we don't know how much that hereditary component. So,
oh, totally.
The parents may also be, either they recognize it in themselves and they're learning and they're frustrated, or they don't identify it in themselves, and that's bringing about other things. And so it's hard.
Yeah. in addition to working as an educator, you've worked as an administrator,
Right.
specifically related to those special education programs. But I feel like administrators often are juggling so many different competing demands, trying also then to make sure that ADHD kids or other neurodivergent students are actually getting the accommodations and the support that they need. But I feel like everything feels so urgent all at once. As somebody who is in a leadership role in the schools, how did you help to make space to prioritize what teachers needed to support those students?
I tried to find out what they needed, where like the holes in their understanding, even with that specific student, because usually it would come up with there's a problem with a student. So how we could look at it, what they needed to know, what they needed to understand better. And some of this comes to, everyone with ADHD is a little bit different. So just because we can say with this student, you should do this and this works, doesn't mean with the next student is also going to work exactly the same way. I know administrators are pulled in all kinds of different directions, and they also really, for the most part, unless they have a background somehow in special education, in neurodiversity, they don't know a lot either. And they're being held to laws and district policies even harder than the teachers are in a way. They're more on the front lines. That is also hard for them. When we could actually go in and have an IEP or work with the teacher or work with the parents and really find out about that student, what that student really needed, that tended to work out best. Because sometimes you go in and here's a list of accommodations and it's like, a fast food restaurant. I'll take one of these and one of these and one of these without really looking at what the student really needs, what really helps the student. And it gets harder because of all the other things going on there. The more that you have an administrator and a teacher and a team that can work together with the student, the better I think it is for everybody. Because what we want when we're talking about students is they're going to grow up, when we want them to be adults in parts of our community and not rely on us and be able to accept and take what they do well and where they need to grow and live their lives like everybody else does.
Well, and speaking of that transition from childhood to adulthood, I often hear this idea that people believe that ADHD is something that kids are eventually just going to grow out of, but it follows people right into adulthood, even if that might look a little bit different for them. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about why you think that particular myth has hung around for so long. And then also, when you're talking with either parents or even adults who are newly diagnosed, how do you help them understand what's actually true about ADHD across the lifespan?
Okay, so let's break this up. The first question, why does this myth hold? I don't know. Unless it's just like this belief, maybe it's from the medical community that if we medicate you, you'll outgrow it. It may also be that if you don't manage the ADHD, it turns into other sorts of behaviors, which may take center stage. You may become more aggressive or defiant and get in trouble. And so the ADHD kind of takes a back seat over other things, which are in a lot of ways, maybe just ways you're acting out or the ways you're dealing with the frustration of having ADHD and not knowing what to do with it. Some students who really learn either with other help or on their own, strategies that they can use, what their strengths are, how to manage it. Although I would argue that that's not always the case. They keep managing it that way. So, I went to school, I taught at school, and then a little over 3 years, I left because I wanted to start being able to work with people on the outside. And having been in a system for basically my whole life that ran around bells and calendars, it has taken me a really long time to figure out how to run a day and a week without that structure. So you may have these people who they know how to be in school. Like you might find that with some people with ADHD who are undiagnosed. They knew how to be in school. They went to college. They knew how to be in school. They may have even kept going, graduate school. If you're that mindset and you know how to play that game, you get some success with that. So you keep going. It's when I think things fall apart, things get hard, that the strategies you set up don't always work anymore. So for some students, it's going from a high school to a college or college to work and relationships. They don't work the same way. And so it could just be so hard with those changes. We're also starting to learn that hormones play some role in this. So girls tend to get diagnosed later for several reasons. And one, we believe, has something to do with hormones, which then if you look at it, as we get older, as other things, pregnancy, menopause, solo no birth control, those kinds of things that are changing you, life is not staying the same, right? Your life is not plateaued and all the same. Everything is changing. And so what are your strategies? How much are you able to get support and help and manage your ADHD?
It's interesting to consider one of the areas that you focus on, which is specifically about grief and how grief surfaces, whether that's for the years that they lost without any support or opportunities that might have looked different if they'd understood themselves earlier. And so normalizing that grief obviously is part of that transition, that identity shift after a diagnosis. And then there's also this trauma-aware lens that folds into this piece too. Can you share about how those two pieces, the grief and the trauma awareness, intersect in the ADHD experience and how we then support that?
So if we're talking about a bigger lens of grief and trauma, to go back to what you said, yes, learning about this later in life leads to grief and trauma about what could have been, what could have happened. But also if you're looking at it at a bigger picture, if it's grief and trauma from that, from a personal loss, from all the things that have happened. If you simply look at grief does things to your brain and your way of functioning. It can make, we talk about grief brain. It can be very hard. All those executive function and emotional regulation issues can be amped up when you're grieving and you're questioning your life, whether it was, why wasn't I diagnosed earlier? Would life have been easier or different? What would have happened had I known that it was this and not that? Or if you're grieving a death or a loss of a job or from a disaster, all of that makes it hard to remember things, to want to be out with people, to do those self-care things like remembering to eat and sleeping well. And then when you have ADHD, that's also still remembering to do things, whatever way ADHD is impacting you and your executive functions. Is it emotional regulation issues? Is it organization? Is it managing things? Is it forgetfulness? And so not that they're the same, but in some ways they really hit you in similar ways. And when you mash them together, it's almost like exponentially or more at times. Just dealing with all of it. And grief is very emotional, whether, again, it's from you finding out something that you feel like you should have known long ago, or someone dying, or whatever happening. And emotional regulation with many of us with ADHD can be hard, right? Can be hard to really control it and manage it. And so it can just crush together in like a tidal wave. And so working on the tools, figuring out what really hits you and when, and what you can do, and what kind of supports, who do you have in your life that if nothing else is understanding and supportive in dealing with both of these, because they push it all together and make it much, much more, in my opinion.
How might this show up in day-to-day? Like I can imagine, for example, somebody who gets this late diagnosis and, people talk about the stages of grief, which of course, they're not like stages that you progress through and then graduate from. It's more of a cycle and it's not necessarily in any particular order. However, that being said, I can imagine somebody who's like very angry perhaps at a parent or, maybe even themselves or a teacher or something in their past where they hadn't received that support. Like that might be one way that grief might manifest in just how they're processing that. What are some other ways that you see that coming to the surface?
So there's the anger. There's also possibly shame, about yourself, questioning so much, maybe regret. You took certain paths because you believe certain things about yourself and other people believe certain things about you, where you wonder if you had taken another path, if you had known more, if you had more support, if you had understood. I think we blame ourselves for a lot of things. I think we internalize the stories about you're lazy or you're forgetful or that kind of stuff. And so the grief of realizing and relooking at, I spent 30, 40, 50 years telling this story that maybe isn't true. And how do you move beyond that? So then maybe therapy for that part of it is good for you. Maybe really taking some looks at it, really diving deep and spending time and just allowing yourself space and grace and support from somebody, from people in your life that, wow, I've just found out about this. Like much like if you had just found out, my daughter who's in law school just found out that she has celiac disease because she was getting sick and sick and sick. And it's not the same thing, but it's similar. It's like, why didn't anyone pick this up before? Why didn't we see? And it's easy, like, oh, as mom, I should have known or I should have seen. But of course I shouldn't. I'm not that kind of a doctor.
Right.
And even her doctors didn't. So I think there's just kind of the stages of grief, even though, like you said, they're not in order and they're not set and they weren't actually made for people who were grieving. They were made for people who themselves were dying of cancer. But kind of accepting that around those ranges, you may be feeling those things at different times and that it's okay, and figuring out things that you can do to work with them. Because we know that fighting the emotions doesn't help. It just shoves it all back in there, which we're used to doing. So figuring that out, looking at that, yes, it's okay to be upset, to be sad, to be scared, to wonder, to regret, and to also be like, wow. You know, it's interesting with people that I know, that I've known for a long time, some of them, when we talked about it, after the fact, it was like, oh yeah, I get it. And there's some people who fight me on it, who like, no. And you just have to wonder why, but that can be the same thing with any kind of grief. People who are accepting you are grieving because of X, and there's people who are like, no, you should be over it, just move on. It doesn't matter, it happened in the past. That's what happened to you when you were 12. You know, when you were in high school and nobody knew anything about your ADHD, you're an adult now, move on.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned this about sometimes what grief looks like can actually look a lot like the same things when you're dealing with ADHD.
Yeah.
Different causes with some of the same outward responses. That overlap can be really confusing. But beyond all of that, okay, so now what? How do we move forward? And I feel like sometimes people are looking for the thing that's going to solve all their problems, the thing that's just going to happen. Check that box and make that problem go away. But sometimes that's not realistic. And so I'm wondering how you approach this with a practical outlook to help people navigate all of those things in a way that really feels sustainable.
So I like looking at what your ADHD has looked like, what it looks like now. What do you feel like you do well and what do you feel like you really struggle with? And has it always been that way? And looking at what helps. You know, sometimes we have built up strategies that actually work. Sometimes we've built up strategies that kind of worked, but they didn't really work. And sometimes we've gone into denial or not dealing with it. So I like starting with the base of, what does it look like for you? What is your ADHD? What does it really look like for you? And how does it impact your life right now? Because some things may impact you at different times, different ways. So we're looking at you now, right now, with your job, your family, and what's really impacting you. Why did this come up? For some reason, you went to a doctor, or even if you didn't go to a doctor, if you didn't go through diagnosis, this has come on your radar. You started getting information. So what's going on in your life that brought this about? And let's look at that. And some of these may be real small, low-hanging fruit that we can address. And some may be bigger, systemic. You're having trouble at work. Your bosses keep saying something to you or your partner. And so looking at those and picking one small part and working on that to build from a little bit of success. And so maybe if you really feel like you're on the verge of losing your job because these things keep happening, and maybe that's most important, then we look at what is the core, what is one of the little core things that you're hearing. You're not on time. You don't remember things. Or maybe for you at work, the noise, like some offices have a lot of noise and that can be really hard. And it's impacting your work in a way, but it's impacting you more. You come home exhausted. You come home upset. And so finding a solution or some solutions that you could take back that might help you with that. So those are bigger things because this involves, having money, having a job, being able to sustain yourself. Or maybe it's smaller things. Like what really bothers me is that when a friend doesn't respond, because this is emotional regulation, when a friend doesn't respond to a text, I feel like they're mad at me. And I worry about that. So you're feeling emotionally dysregulated about that. So looking at the thoughts for that, not as therapists, we're not therapists, but like looking at that and brainstorming and thinking about ways maybe in the past you talked about it with somebody who you feel safe talking to it about. Do you feel like even one friend you could go to and say, when you don't text me back, this is what I'm thinking. And, this is me. And picking someone who you trust and who you think would have an honest conversation with you. So figuring out where we want to start, because you can't solve anything. No book, no program, no any of that is going to solve everything, no matter what you have.
Mm-hmm.
If you have the flu, you may need a couple of different medicines. But looking at it like that, because ADHD can have this tendency to want to do it all now.
Yeah.
Something brought this to your mind. You didn't walk into the doctor and this person randomly said you have ADHD out of nowhere, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Something brought this up. So what is it? How is it impacting you? And what's most meaningful for you to start looking at and working with? So you feel success, you feel you have some control, and you feel you can make those changes.
Do you have a couple of hacks or strategies that you feel like are really useful but get underutilized that you could share?
I think acceptance is very underutilized. It seems obvious, but we can be so hard on ourselves. And people who maybe live with us or work with us, who are neurotypical, who don't understand, have to put up with a lot from us. And so working on acceptance without blame, without making excuses, because, if I do these things and I don't make any attempt to change it, then that's not good either. I also really like breaking things down into much smaller chunks. I'm big on tasks being into smaller chunks, my week being in smaller chunks. It's very easy for me to sit down and plan out my entire year for my business, which is a joke because a lot of that's not going to happen the way but I'll spend hours and use markers and highlighters and all kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, we're great big picture thinkers.
It's your great big picture, but I'm learning how to bring it into a smaller picture. And one of the things I have started doing, I got this from somebody else who uses it in a bigger way. At their business, they do, I guess, a 3-week sprint. So for 3 weeks in their business, they will focus on one thing, one project, and then they take a week where they're like they look it over. They don't deal with any of it. They don't have meetings, that kind of stuff. Well, 3 weeks is way too much for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I've broken it down into 3 days, and I'm calling it a 3-day sprint. And I think for me, and I think for a lot of other people, this is really great. So I say, okay, what am I going to work on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday? And it's just one part of what I'm doing. And I get better, and it depends on the week, of getting those things finished. I want to work on editing this tiny book.
Mm-hmm.
And when I get to Friday and I look back on it, and this goes back to giving yourself grace, and it takes practice saying, okay, how did it go? Did I finish it? Did I not finish it? Yeah, I'm not bad if I didn't finish it. Why didn't I? Did everything in the world, did the dog get sick and, all these things?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it too much? Was I too hopeful? Or, yeah, I got this done. And so my next step is this. And so again, a little project, looking back on it, and then the next. So this works with my business. It works a little bit on my home. It's a little bit harder because I don't have interest in doing things in my home, but they need to be done. But you could use it, depending on your job, you may or may not be able to, but maybe you have a hobby or some project that you're doing, you're planning something. So, okay, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, whatever your 3 days are, and it's not all day, right? I have an hour a day or I have 3 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making the guest lists for the party.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. Not 17 things, because if you're like me, the list is long. I'll go on a 3-day weekend and have a 3-page list of what I believe I might get done, which is not going to happen.
Mm-mm.
So I think working on it, and it can be hard depending on what your projects are, what your requirements are, breaking things down into something small and giving yourself a little bit of time. And that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And it's hard.
It is hard. But I like that, though. It's kind of batching those items,
Yes.
but then direct focus without feeling like you're being pulled in too many different directions.
Another thing is when you feel like your head is too full with all the things you have to do, I like writing them down, and not just writing them down, but writing them down on little Post-its
Mm-hmm.
and then going and sticking them on a wall, on the refrigerator, or whatever, because they're out of your head.
Yeah.
And it's easy to move them around into grouping however you need to. And it's there, but it's not stuck up here clogging everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Jen, this has been such a great conversation. Before we close, I have one last question for you. If you were talking to someone who has just recently been diagnosed as ADHD and they're feeling a little overwhelmed, what would you share with them? What is the one thing that you would most want them to hear?
I'd most want them to hear, I'm glad you figured this out, and take it one step at a time. Mm-hmm. And listen to yourself. Because like we talked about with the programs and the books, everybody has an opinion, but listen to yourself.
Dr. Jennifer Dall of ADHD Holistically, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Something that stood out to me in this conversation is Jennifer's reminder that grief isn't just about loss in the way we usually think about it. For neurodivergent people, it can be the grief of years trying to fit into classrooms that weren't built for them, or the grief of realizing how often their struggles were dismissed as laziness or lack of effort. It's the weight of needs that were never met, and the quiet frustration of wondering how different life could have been if things had just been understood earlier. And what Jennifer brings into focus is that we don't have to push that grief aside in order to move forward. In fact, naming it is often the most healing first step. When we acknowledge those feelings, instead of minimizing them or chasing a perfect fix, we create space for self-compassion. And that's what allows sustainable strategies to take root. It's a reminder that we don't need to be perfect to make progress. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Won't you save, 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 save me? Won't you save, 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 save me? Won't you save, 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 save me? Oh, save me, save, save me.
Big thanks to Jennifer Dall. It was a fascinating discussion. You can learn more about her and the work she does via links in the show notes. Hey, also, we are fresh into October, and that means it's National ADHD Awareness Month. It's also Mental Health Awareness Month and National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Oh, and it's also Stamp Collecting Month, so philatelists, stick together, okay? Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Won't you save, 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 save me? Won't you save, 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 save me?
This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance,